Did you know that behind Queen Esther's story, there was a forgotten mentor? Mordecai, an overlooked and often ignored character, was more than just a man working behind the scenes. He defied kings, exposed conspiracies, and faced deadly enemies, raising an intriguing question. Was he a brilliant strategist guided by God, or did he manipulate events, using Esther as a key piece to fulfill his own objectives? Was Mordecai merely reacting to circumstances, or was he in fact steering events with almost calculated skill? His guidance for Esther to conceal her Jewish identity and his direct challenge to the powerful Haman are acts of courage, but also of great risk. Was this part of a clear and spiritual vision, or an attempt to control an uncertain destiny? Get ready to dive into a story full of mystery, strategy, and divine interventions. Discover how Mordecai defied fate, faced powerful enemies, and left us with precious lessons that remain relevant to this day. Do you know the story of Mordecai? To many, he is merely a secondary figure in the story of Esther, but what if I told you he was the true strategist behind the events that saved the Jewish people from annihilation? Was he simply caring for his orphaned cousin, or was there more behind his actions? And the most intriguing question, was Mordecai the mentor who shaped Esther, or merely a pawn manipulated by a greater plan? Mordecai's story begins in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, a place where the Jews lived as exiles. He was a simple man, but one of unshakable faith. After the death of Esther's parents, his cousin, he took on the responsibility of raising her. So far, it seems like a story of family dedication, right? But things start to get interesting when King Xerxes, after rejecting Queen Vashti, decides to search for a new queen. And this is where Mordecai comes into play. Mordecai not only encouraged Esther to participate in the selection process, but also gave her curious advice to hide her Jewish identity. Now think about this. Why would he ask Esther to hide who she really was? Was he trying to protect her? Or did he already see a strategic opportunity to position Esther in a place of power? This decision wasn't just risky, it placed Esther in a dangerous political game. But was this part of Mordecai's plan or God's plan? Esther quickly gained the favor of everyone in the palace, including Hegai, the official in charge of the harem, and, most importantly, King Xerxes himself. She was crowned queen, yet Mordecai didn't distance himself. He stayed close, watching everything and ensuring Esther was prepared for the challenges to come. This raises an intriguing question. To what extent was Mordecai in control of the situation? Was he a wise mentor or someone unknowingly guided by divine forces? The story takes on a tone of urgency when Mordecai uncovers a conspiracy to assassinate the king. Two palace officials were plotting to kill Xerxes, but Mordecai, always vigilant, discovered the plan. He informed Esther, who alerted the king, mentioning that the information came from Mordecai. The plot was thwarted, and Mordecai's name was recorded in the kingdom's chronicles. Now here's the controversial point. Did Mordecai act out of simple loyalty to the king, or was he already calculating the necessary steps to ensure his future relevance? Another interesting detail is the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. He wasn't just a protector, he was a strategist. But were his actions always motivated by altruism? Or did he already understand that Esther was a key figure in protecting the Jewish people? This leads us to an important reflection. How often do we underestimate the actions of those around us, not realizing they may be acting more strategically than we imagine? Mordecai's advice to Esther to hide her identity also raises questions about faith and strategy. Was it an act of prudence or a demonstration of a lack of faith in God? Was he putting Esther in danger, or trusting that she would be in the right place at the right time? This dilemma resonates even today. How often do we make decisions that seem wise, but lead us to question whether we are truly trusting in God? Mordecai teaches us something powerful. Even the simplest actions can have great repercussions. Discovering a conspiracy, guiding Esther, staying alert to movements in the palace, all seemed small, but each of these actions was essential to God's greater plan, and it makes us wonder, could God also be using our small choices for something greater, even when we don't realize it? This first chapter of Mordecai's story is full of mysteries, dilemmas, and questions that make us think. Was he really in control of the situation? Or was he just a piece in God's plan? Was his guidance to Esther based on faith or human strategy? And most importantly, what can we learn from his choices? Mordecai is widely recognized as a devoted mentor who guided and protected Esther throughout her journey. However, his influence over her goes beyond paternal advice. He not only cared for Esther, but also strategically guided her in decisions that shaped her destiny, such as when he suggested she hide her Jewish identity upon entering the king's palace. This choice, though prudent given the prejudice against Jews at the time, also raises questions about the balance between protection and control. As a man attentive to details, Mordecai stayed close to the palace, observing the movements and ensuring that Esther was safe and well-positioned. His constant vigilance was not just a reflection of care, but of a clear understanding that Esther held a unique position of power. He knew that, at that moment in history, his cousin would play a role greater than anyone could imagine. This strategic vision is admirable, but also brings to light the complexity of his intentions. To what extent was he guiding Esther out of faith, and to what extent was he using his influence to ensure she fulfilled a crucial role? On the other hand, Mordecai's genuine care for Esther is undeniable. He raised her as a daughter and dedicated himself to protecting her in a hostile and unpredictable environment. His guidance was essential in decisive moments, but it is impossible to ignore that he also saw in her the potential for something much greater. Did Mordecai recognize Esther as a key figure in a larger plan from the beginning, or did he only realize this as events unfolded? Esther, in turn, demonstrated an impressive level of trust in Mordecai. Even after becoming queen, she continued to listen to and follow his guidance. This mutual trust was solid, but also makes us reflect. Did Esther follow Mordecai's advice out of dependence, or because she believed he knew what was best? Their dynamic was not merely familial, but profoundly strategic and spiritual. One of the most fascinating aspects of this relationship is that, despite his active role, Mordecai also knew when to step back, allowing Esther to take the lead in critical decisions. He challenged her to act with courage and responsibility, such as when he said, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" This phrase encapsulates Mordecai's role as a mentor and reveals his ability to recognize that Esther needed to take charge of her own mission. What this relationship teaches us is that Mordecai was not just a protector or strategist, but someone who understood the balance between guiding and allowing Esther to grow independently. His influence shaped the queen Esther became, but he also knew how to respect the moment when she needed to make her own decisions, even if it meant facing mortal dangers. The story of Mordecai and Esther invites us to reflect on the mentors in our own lives. Who are the people guiding us? Are we allowing their words to direct us toward God's plans, or are we straying from divine purpose? Likewise, are we capable of guiding others with wisdom, as Mordecai did, without imposing our own desires on them? He was a wise mentor, but also a strategist who saw beyond the present. His influence not only protected Esther, but ensured that she was ready to fulfill the role she had been called to. If there is one moment in Mordecai's story that changed everything, It was his refusal to bow before Haman. This simple act of defiance directly challenged the second most powerful man in the empire and set off a chain of events that would put the fate of the Jewish people at risk. But why did Mordecai make this decision? Was it a demonstration of faith, courage, or something deeper, like a desire to provoke Haman and expose his plans? And above all, did he understand the consequences of his choice? Haman was one of King Xerxes' highest officials and had been promoted to a position of supreme authority over all other leaders in the empire. The king's decree ordered all subjects to bow before Haman as a sign of respect. However, Mordecai, a devout Jew, refused to bow. To him, this gesture was more than a political formality. It was a symbol of worship and submission, something he could never offer to a man. Now consider this: was Mordecai's refusal merely an act of faithfulness to God, or did he already perceive the danger Haman represented? Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites, historical enemies of Israel, which may have intensified the conflict between them. Was Mordecai trying to protect his people from the outset, or was he simply reacting on principle? This question adds depth to Mordecai's character and raises doubts about his motivations. When Haman discovered that Mordecai refused to bow, his reaction was immediate and extreme. He was not satisfied with punishing Mordecai alone. He decided to exterminate the entire Jewish people. This disproportionate response reveals not only Haman's pride and thirst for power, but also his deep hatred for the Jews. He persuaded the king to issue a decree allowing the annihilation of all Jews in the empire, offering a vast sum of silver to the royal treasury to seal the deal. When the decree was published, Mordecai's reaction was intense and public. He tore his clothes, donned sackcloth and ashes, and mourned bitterly in the square before the palace. This act of mourning was not merely an expression of despair, it was a call to action. Mordecai knew that to stop Haman's plan, he would need to mobilize Esther and, through her, reach the king. Here, we see a different side of Mordecai. He did not simply react to the decree, he devised a plan. Knowing Esther's position as queen, he summoned her to intervene on behalf of the Jewish people. But even at this critical moment, Mordecai faced an obstacle. Esther hesitated. She knew that approaching the king without being summoned could result in her death. And it is at this point that Mordecai delivers one of the most powerful lines in the entire story. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. This statement not only challenged Esther to act, but also raised a larger question. Were all the events leading up to that moment, Mordecai's advice for Esther to conceal her identity, her rise to the throne, and even Haman's decree, part of the greater divine plan? Was Mordecai trying to convince Esther, or was he already convinced himself that God was in control of everything? This moment also challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we hesitate to act, even knowing we are in a strategic position? Are we ignoring the opportunities God gives us to make a difference, or are we waiting for a guarantee of success before moving forward? Mordecai's refusal to bow before Haman reminds us that acts of faith and courage are rarely easy or safe. His decision put not only his own life at risk, but also the lives of his entire people. Yet it was this courage that set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the salvation of the Jews. It makes us wonder, are we willing to make difficult decisions, even knowing they may cost us dearly? Are we ready to stand firm in our faith, even when it means facing opposition? Take advantage of being here and subscribe to our channel now, so you won't miss any messages that strengthen your faith. Haman's decree was clear. On a specific date, all the Jewish people in the Persian Empire would be exterminated. Men, women, and children were condemned by a decision born from one man's wounded pride. The weight of this threat fell squarely on Mordecai's shoulders. He knew he had to act swiftly, but his only hope lay with Esther, now queen. Here, Mordecai's strategy and faith would be tested to their limits. When Mordecai learned of the decree, his reaction was immediate. He donned sackcloth and ashes, a public expression of mourning and despair. But his goal was not merely to lament. He wanted to capture Esther's attention. He knew she was in a privileged position, but he also understood that approaching the king uninvited meant risking her own life. How could he convince Esther to act? And more importantly, would she be willing to put her position and life on the line for her people? The dialogue between Mordecai and Esther at this moment is one of the most emotional and strategic exchanges in the story. Initially, Esther hesitates. She reminds Mordecai of the law. Anyone who approached the king without being summoned could be executed unless the king extended the golden scepter. She argues that her position as queen does not guarantee her safety. But Mordecai responds with words that resonate to this day. Do not think that because you are in the king's palace, you alone will escape. He reminds her that if she does not act, deliverance will come from another place, but she and her family will not be spared. In other words, Mordecai challenges Esther to recognize that her silence would not protect her. Here lies the crucial point. Mordecai appeals not only to Esther's sense of responsibility, but to something greater. He suggests that Esther's rise to the throne was no coincidence, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. This statement is not just a challenge, it is a reminder that God is in control even in the midst of chaos. Mordecai believes that Esther was placed in the right place at the right time to fulfill a divine purpose. But did Esther believe this too? Esther's response is one of the most defining moments of the story. After hearing Mordecai, she decides to act, but not before taking a crucial spiritual step. Esther asks Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa for a 3-day fast. She and her attendants would also fast, spiritually preparing themselves for the challenge ahead. This act shows that Esther, though hesitant at first, understood the gravity of her mission and trusted in divine intervention. This episode raises profound questions. How often does God place us in strategic positions, but we hesitate to act out of fear or uncertainty? Are we willing to risk our lives, positions, or comfort for the sake of others? And above all, do we recognize the moments when God calls us to fulfill a greater purpose? Mordecai, in turn, proved to be not just a mentor, but a spiritual leader. He not only guided Esther, but also mobilized the entire Jewish community to seek God's help. This moment is a powerful reminder that while we have roles to play, it is God who holds ultimate control. Mordecai did not know how things would end, but he trusted that God would not abandon his people. Another interesting aspect is the mutual trust between Mordecai and Esther. He knew he had to challenge her, even if it meant pushing her out of her comfort zone. On the other hand, Esther trusted Mordecai enough to follow his guidance, even in a life-or-death situation. This dynamic raises an important question. Are we surrounded by people who challenge us to be better and to make courageous decisions? Or are we surrounded by voices that keep us comfortable but stagnant? This part of the story reminds us that faith and action go hand in hand. Mordecai trusted God, but he also acted. He challenged Esther, mobilized the community, and used his influence to make a difference. It makes us wonder, are we willing to act in faith, even when circumstances seem impossible? Are we prepared to take risks for what we believe? As the story continues, we will see how Esther's courage and Mordecai's strategy changed the course of events. But for now, the challenge remains. How can we recognize the moments when God places us in strategic positions to fulfill His will? And more importantly, are we ready to respond to His call? After the 3-day fast, Esther rose with courage and determination to face one of the most dangerous moments of her life. She knew that approaching the king uninvited was a risk of death, but she also understood that this was the moment for which she had been prepared. While Esther stood on the front lines, behind her was Mordecai, continuing to guide and support her mission with strategy and faith. But to what extent did Mordecai shape Esther's actions? Was he in control or merely fulfilling a role within a greater divine plan? Esther did not act impulsively. Her decision to present herself to the king was carefully planned. Clothed in her finest royal attire, she positioned herself at the entrance to King Xerxes' throne room. When he saw her, he extended the golden scepter, signaling that she could approach. In that moment, Esther not only saved her life, but also opened the door to save her entire people. Yet her approach was strategic. Instead of immediately exposing Haman's plan, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Now think about this. Why did Esther choose this indirect method? Was it something she decided on her own, or was Mordecai involved in influencing her strategy? To this day, scholars debate whether Esther was acting solely on her wisdom or following instructions Mordecai might have given before the fast. Either way, her approach demonstrated patience, intelligence, and above all, dependence on God. At the first banquet, Esther continued to build her strategy. She revealed nothing to the king, but invited him and Haman to a second banquet. This delay was crucial, as it allowed time for God to begin moving the pieces into place. That very night, the king, unable to sleep, ordered the royal chronicles to be read to him. It was then that he discovered Mordecai had saved his life by exposing the conspiracy of Bigthana and Teresh. This triggered a series of events that would lead to Mordecai's exaltation and Haman's downfall. Imagine the scene. While Haman was plotting to build a gallows for Mordecai, the king was commanding Haman to honor the very man he sought to kill. Haman was forced to lead Mordecai through the streets of Susa, proclaiming his honor. This moment was more than an ironic twist. It was a demonstration of how God uses circumstances to frustrate the plans of the wicked. And here arises an important question. Did Mordecai trust this unfolding of events, or was he as unaware of the outcome as everyone else? Did he understand that God was working behind the scenes? At the second banquet, Esther finally revealed her identity and exposed Haman's plan. With wisdom and courage, she told the king that her people were in danger and that Haman was responsible. Xerxes, furious, ordered Haman to be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. This victory was not Esther's alone. It was also Mordecai's, who had placed Esther in that position and encouraged her to act at the right moment. But here's the intriguing point. Did Mordecai foresee that everything would unfold this way? Did he have full confidence that God would use Esther to reverse the situation, or was he simply doing what he could step by step without seeing the full picture? This uncertainty makes the story even more fascinating, as it reflects the tension many of us feel when acting in faith without knowing exactly how things will turn out. Another important aspect is the balance between human strategy and divine dependence. Mordecai and Esther made detailed plans, but also trusted God to move circumstances in their favor. This combination is a powerful model for our lives. Are we diligent in planning and acting while also leaving room for God to work? Or are we trying to control everything ourselves? This part of the story challenges us to reflect on how we use our positions and opportunities. Just as Esther was called for a specific moment, we too have times when we are called to act. Are we willing to risk our safety and comfort for the greater good? And like Mordecai, are we encouraging those around us to do the same? Mordecai and Esther show us that courage and wisdom combined with faith can change the course of history. The victory over Haman was only the beginning of a movement that ensured the salvation of the Jewish people. Haman's downfall is one of the most dramatic and ironic moments in the story of Esther. The man who planned the destruction of the Jews and the execution of Mordecai ended up being hanged on the very gallows he had built for his enemy. But was this turn of events the direct result of Mordecai's strategy, or was it a clear and undeniable act of divine intervention? This uncertainty makes the outcome even more fascinating. After the second banquet hosted by Esther, everything changed for Haman. During the banquet, Esther revealed her true identity as a Jew and exposed Haman's plan to annihilate her people. Imagine Haman's shock upon realizing that the queen, the most influential woman in the kingdom after the king, belonged to the group he sought to destroy. The impact of this revelation was immediate. King Xerxes was furious and stormed out to the palace garden to collect his thoughts. Meanwhile, Haman, panicking, threw himself at Esther's feet, begging for his life. What happened next perfectly illustrates how God can use circumstances to overturn seemingly impossible situations. When the king returned to the banquet and saw Haman at Esther's feet, he interpreted the scene as an attempt to assault the queen. This misunderstanding sealed Haman's fate. Xerxes immediately ordered Haman's execution, and in a moment of divine irony, Haman was hanged on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. But here's the intriguing point. Did Mordecai anticipate that Haman would be exposed in such a dramatic fashion? Or did he simply trust that God would intervene in some way? It's impossible not to wonder how much Mordecai's strategy influenced the outcome. He guided Esther to act at the right time, but the way the events unfolded was clearly more than mere coincidence. God was working behind the scenes, yet he used the actions of Mordecai and Esther to fulfill his plan. This story also prompts a profound reflection on divine justice. Haman, who sought to destroy God's people, faced the consequences of his own actions. His arrogance, pride, and hatred became the instruments of his downfall. This makes us consider, how often do we witness situations in life that seem unjust, only for God to resolve them in ways we could never predict? Haman's story reminds us that while evil may prosper for a time, it will never prevail against God's justice. Another fascinating aspect is Mordecai's role after Haman's fall. The king gave Mordecai the signet ring that once belonged to Haman, symbolizing authority and power. Mordecai, who began as an exiled Jew with no position or influence, was elevated to a place of prominence in the empire. This moment demonstrates that God not only defends the righteous, but also honors them in ways beyond what we can imagine. Mordecai remained faithful and steadfast, and God rewarded him for his courage and integrity. Yet, there's another question we can't ignore. Did Mordecai know that his faith and actions would lead him this far? He started his journey by protecting Esther and fighting for his people's survival, without knowing how it would all end. This teaches us that God often doesn't reveal the entire plan at once. He calls us to act in faith, step by step, trusting him even when the path seems uncertain. Haman's fall also challenges us to reflect on how we deal with injustice in our own lives. Are we willing to wait for divine justice, trusting that God will resolve things in his time, or do we try to take control and force outcomes? Mordecai's story teaches us that patience and faithfulness are rewarded, even when the waiting is difficult. This part of the story shows us how God uses the humble to confound the powerful. Haman, who wielded all the power and influence, fell before Mordecai, a man who in the world's eyes was a nobody. This reminds us that God does not look at our positions or titles, but at our hearts and our faith. Are we willing to trust him, even when circumstances seem impossible? Mordecai's story does not end with Haman's fall. In fact, his true victory began after that moment. The man who was once an exiled Jew without position or influence rose to become the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire. But what does this legacy teach us? Was Mordecai merely an instrument in God's plan, or did he actively shape the course of history through his choices and strategies? After Haman's execution, King Xerxes gave Esther control over her enemy's estate. Esther, in turn, entrusted its administration to Mordecai. Additionally, the ring that symbolized Haman's power was given to him. This transfer of authority is clear proof that God not only protects his people, but also exalts those who remain faithful. Mordecai did not use his newfound position for personal gain. His priority was to protect and ensure the safety of the Jewish people. However, there was a significant challenge. Haman's decree allowing the extermination of the Jews was still in effect. According to Persian law, a royal decree could not be revoked, but a new decree could be issued. Together, Esther and Mordecai pleaded with the king for a solution. Xerxes authorized Mordecai to draft a new decree permitting the Jews to defend themselves on the day set for the attack. Now consider this. What does this teach us about faith and action? Mordecai trusted that God was in control, but he did not sit idly by waiting for a miracle. He acted with wisdom and strategy, demonstrating that true faith is not passive, but dynamic and courageous. How often in our own lives does God call us to combine faith with action? Are we ready to take responsibility and lead as Mordecai did? When the day of confrontation arrived, the Jews not only defended themselves, but also defeated their enemies. Mordecai's growing prominence and influence instilled fear across the empire, discouraging many from fighting against the Jews. This outcome is a powerful testament to how God can overturn impossible situations, turning fear into victory. Following these events, Mordecai not only saved his people, but also established a lasting legacy. He instituted the celebration of Purim, a festival commemorating the salvation of the Jews and God's faithfulness. To this day, this celebration serves as a reminder that God protects his people and works through ordinary men and women to accomplish extraordinary purposes. However, Mordecai's legacy also raises important questions. Why is he often overshadowed by Esther? Could his humility and behind-the-scenes role have made him less noticeable to the world, even though he played such a crucial part? This challenges us to reflect on how we value those who work behind the scenes in great stories. Are we willing to acknowledge the impact of people like Mordecai in our lives and communities? Another significant aspect is that Mordecai never sought his own glory. He was faithful to God and to his people, and his actions reflect selfless and courageous leadership. In a world where we are often tempted to seek recognition, Mordecai's story reminds us that true legacy is built when we prioritize God's purpose and the well-being of others above our own interests. Mordecai's story challenges us to examine our own legacy. What are we building with our lives? Are we leaving a positive and lasting impact on those around us? Are we willing to act with faith and courage even when circumstances are difficult or when our efforts go unrecognized? Like Mordecai, we can be instruments of God to transform impossible situations and leave a testimony that inspires future generations. Mordecai's life teaches us that every action matters, that faith combined with courage can change the course of history, and that God honors those who remain faithful even amidst adversity. As we reflect on his story, the question remains, are we ready to live with the same courage, wisdom, and dedication that he demonstrated? Mordecai's story teaches us that God never forgets his people and that he can use anyone, anywhere, to accomplish something extraordinary. Just as Mordecai was called for a greater purpose, God is calling you today. He knows your fears, your struggles and the dreams you hold in your heart. But to live out the incredible plans He has for you, you need to take a step of faith. You're not watching this video by chance. Perhaps this is the moment God has prepared to change your life, to transform your heart, and to give you a new beginning. If you feel God's call, don't resist. He loves you and is inviting you to trust Him. If you want to give your life to Jesus or reconcile with Him, pray this prayer with me now, with sincerity in your heart. Lord God, I acknowledge that I am a sinner and that I need you. Today, I surrender my life into your hands and accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. I believe that He died for me and rose again to give me new life. Forgive my sins, transform my heart, and guide my steps. From this day forward, I want to live for your purpose. In Jesus' name, amen. If this story touched your heart, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Don't underestimate the power of spreading God's word. And if you want to keep learning about the mysteries and hidden lessons of the Bible, subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and remember, your interaction helps bring this message to more people. Together, we can impact thousands of lives. May God bless and strengthen you. See you in the next video.